Hey everybody, and welcome to I'd Read YA's Y'all West panel. I'm so excited to be talking about shelf care with these wonderful YA authors. Shelf care, what is shelf care? What are we going to be talking about? Shelf care is talking about how basically when authors put things that matter to them deeply into their books, oftentimes readers will then be able to take them from the books and use them to help them with their own lives. And that is something that all of these authors have done beautifully, both in the books that they've already written, but in the books that they have coming out this year. So I'm so excited to talk about that, to sort of give you a behind-the-scenes glimpse of what went into these books and what it was like. And certainly we're now at the point where we're all talking about what it was like to write during a pandemic. And certainly shelf care was very important for authors for that, as well as for readers. And we'll also talk about what readers do get from the books, either the books they've already published or what they hope readers will get out of the books that are coming out. So with me, in no particular order, we have Brianna Bourne, Francisco Stork, Debbie Rigaud, Leah Johnson, Mason Deaver, and Sabina Khan. So we're going to start. I'm going to ask each of you individually a little bit about your books, and then we're going to go on into the panel. And we're going to start with you, Sabina, because again, we're talking a lot of you really put a lot of yourself in the books. And you've already talked about your new book, Zahra Hussain is Here, about how it really brought you back to something that had happened to you when you were dealing with a lot of really awful things that made you question America as home, just nature of home. And I would love for you to talk about sort of the story behind the story, and also talk about what it was like to revisit it, but through the eyes of a teenager now.
Thank you, David, and I'm so excited to be here. So this is my new book, Zahra Hussain is Here. It just came out less than a week ago. And this was based on something that happened to me and my family about 20 years ago when we were living in Corpus Christi, Texas, where this book is set as well. And my husband at the time had a work visa, and I was on a dependent visa, and my children are U.S. citizens. And we were waiting for our green cards, which, we'd been waiting for several years, and we were told we were almost at the end of the process. So we were very much looking forward to having our green cards and then really getting on with our lives, because it was hard to plan anything until we had the card in hand. And, you can't buy property. There's so many things you can't do. And it's horrible to live with this sort of, feeling that, your whole life is sort of contingent upon this one thing. But anyway, we were happy to wait and, go through the legal process, which is very long. After, just like the year, a few months before our my husband's work visa was set to expire, he called in to the lawyer to see, what the status was, how when we should anticipate getting the green cards. And the lawyer very casually told him that because he'd forgotten to file something, the whole process was now derailed, and we would just have to leave the country, because now, it would just we'd have to go through additional steps, and we'd have to leave the country for those steps to be possible. And we just had our second child, and we had a very young child already. And so this just literally pulled the rug from under us, and we were not expecting this at all. We had no financial preparation. We didn't know where to go. My husband and I are from two different countries, so it wasn't as if we could just go to, a random place and live there. So it was all really difficult for us to go through at the time, not knowing, what we were going to do and how it was all going to pan out. Luckily, we, through friends and through different resources, we decided to apply as permanent residents to Canada. And that's where we've been living for the last 20 years. And we love it here. We have a great life. But at the same time, that fear and that uncertainty, those feelings haven't really gone away. We still can't drive past certain places and, kind of revisit certain things without feeling that kind of, it's something that sticks with you, because now that it's quite easy for something like for your home to be taken away, and the place where you thought, you would live, grow old together and, raise your children is now suddenly like not that place anymore. And more than that, it was, I think, that feeling that every time we spoke with immigration trying to figure out what we could do, that feeling that we were so dispensable that, our contributions to the community meant nothing, and that, they were just telling us to go home. And for us, home was Corpus Christi at the time. That was our home. That's where we planned to, build it, to continue living. And so I wanted to write about, this kind of these kinds of problems, because I read articles and I hear about people still having these kind of problems, and it's something that a lot of people might not know about, because these are the kind of the quieter issues where somebody has to go to the end of the line once they age out. So if they're, for example, if they've applied for their green card along with their parents, once the kids turn 21, they're no longer dependent on their parents. So now they have to go to the end of the line and start over. But a lot of them were either born here or not born here. Of course, if they were born here, they wouldn't need it. But they came here as infants, and so they don't know any other home. And my children were born in the States, but I still had to obviously take them with me. So they were being displaced either way. And so that was my real purpose of writing this book, was to share what happens and how hard it is for immigrants to have to jump through these hoops and never really feel safe, never get to feel safe, and that they're actually at home, in their home. And writing this, I have to say, it's been 20 years since we moved, and, everything's good now, everything's great. But writing this brought up a lot of feelings for me, and it was hard. And the thing is, it's a whole generation later now, and these things are still happening. Even worse, things that are happening are much, much worse. So yeah, it was hard, but it was, at the same time, it was sort of cathartic for me. And I also it was really great for me to write a character that's actually fighting back and pushing back in a way that I couldn't back then. And so, that really gave me a lot of satisfaction. It was really important to me to write a character who, fights for her space and doesn't just go because she's told that, she needs to leave. And so she finds a way, she fights until she finds a way to stay in the only place that she knows as home.
And that's certainly a factor of author self-care, that we do get to make our characters stronger than we necessarily are in a moment. When we have time to actually compose it, we can understand our responses even more. And it's amazing that you revisited it in such a real, raw way. I mean, it's such a striking book. Going now to Mason, again, continuing the theme, again, because you've talked about this book already, The Ghosts We Keep, which is heartbreaking and extraordinary, and just to read it is really to engage with what grief is really like. And the notion that there are no easy answers, there is just navigation, basically. And so you were dealing with grief, and have talked about how you wrote this book in part to try to articulate some of what was happening, but obviously not writing a memoir, but writing about a character. So can you talk about that, about sort of how your own grieving process and sort of the grieving process within the book meshed up, and what you found by exploring that?
There's no easy way to answer this. I feel like, and you would think that I should probably figure that out, because I'm going to be asked that quite often, I feel like. I mean, really, there was this need in me to write this book. Whenever we were, working on selling I Wish You All the Best, I had a second book already in mind. I had, plot, characters, and everything that I, thought that I needed to, hopefully, if I Wish You All the Best, works and sells, we have this thing to follow it up. And if it doesn't, I have another thing to work on and spend my time. And then in 2017, about a month after I actually signed with my agent, Lauren, my father was killed, much in the same way that Ethan is in the book. And that kind of, like you said, it derailed everything, essentially, much like the death of one's father would. So it was this need and this desire in me to tell this story, to really get these feelings out of me. I didn't, a week after the funeral, didn't hop into my Word document and didn't start, writing ooh, this is what I'm feeling. But, as I tried to navigate the process, I was finding it very difficult to really parse together what I was feeling, and also witnessing what my brother and what my mother were going through. You know, they were experiencing the same kind of grief, but in a completely different way, which is, I think, what I wanted to show with this book, especially with the characters of Liam and Marcus, is that these are two people who are experiencing the same type of grief. They both lost the same person who meant a humongous deal to them, and yet they are two completely different people who are processing this death in two completely different ways. And that was kind of the lesson that I had to teach myself with this book. And I'm 2 for 2 right now on using my own books to teach myself lessons. So I wonder what that says about me. But like, I really wanted to write a story where grief is explicitly stated as being this thing that no one experiences the same way. Like, sure, there are similarities between different people's grief. You know, there has to be. There's so many people in the world going through so many things, but there's also just going to be so many differences, so many nuances, like from subtle to big differences that just every person is going to experience. And that's really what I wanted to show and work out, and almost give myself permission in a way to grieve in the way that I felt that I needed to. And, you know, it's not 100%. Therapy probably would have been nice, but, you know, it's money. Turn your art into trauma, kids. Or no, turn your trauma into art. Turn your art into trauma too. But yeah, it was really just the gateway for me to work all those feelings out. And it was something that I desperately needed to get out. And I think that the book is probably a little too real because of that, but maybe someone needs it. I know that I did, and I think that I did what I set out to do. So
I think you did too. And I, as a reader, again, was going through a very similar thing. And yeah, it was as cathartic to read and experience as a reader as it was as an author, albeit in different ways. So Leah, change tack a little bit here with Rise of the Sun, because I want to talk to you sort of not about a great theme, but more almost about setting. Cool. Because no, the book, again, I'll let you talk about it, but it talks about sort of being in a concert space, in a festival space, and how music can be catharsis. Being in a space where you are surrounded by strangers can be a catharsis. Meeting different people who you never would have ordinarily met in this way can be a catharsis, can actually teach you so much about yourself, because you are stepping out of yourself and giving yourself over to the music. And I know that this is something that has meant a lot to you. It's something that means a lot to me. And so I loved what you did with that, with this book. So can you talk about that, just talking about taking your experience just as, again, with music and as a concert goer, and turning it into a novel, and what that meant for the character?
For sure. So, you know, one of the things that I value most in my life is my relationship to music, but specifically live music, right? And part of that is because of the communal joy that exists in these spaces, and the element of freedom that comes along with being surrounded by people you don't know and likely will never see again. The way you can lose yourself to this thing that all of you are somehow a part of in that moment. And it was really freeing to be able to write something like this in a world that no longer, like, I'm writing about a world that no longer existed, right? Like, I was doing this all throughout 2020, working on the book, and I was the furthest thing from a concert, from a festival, from leaving my bedroom even. And so being able to drop myself into this environment and sort of write through these feelings of joy, of fear, of family that somehow all emerge within a concert space or a festival space. It was an avenue for me to reconnect to these things in a world that I felt really disconnected from in the time, but also an opportunity to use a space that is not generally considered a microcosm for all the things that exist out in the real world, to sort of work through these ideas of, there's a little bit of, there's like grief that is in the book. There's emerging queerness that's in the book, and like all these things that I got to sort of toy with my first book, throwing a lot of the same elements in a completely different space and retooling them with this like loud, ebullient undercurrent of music felt like a natural progression for me. And also, like, I'm just really glad Scholastic bought the book, because what else would I have done in 2020 had I not been able to work on this book? So it was a real playground for exploration as far as like things that I no longer felt like I got to hold on to in my real life.
So Shelf Care, it makes you just create the concerts that you yourself cannot go to at the moment.
Right. What did Mason say? Turn your trauma into art. Yeah. Turn your pandemic into a pantheon of exploration, honey. That's my motto. Yeah.
All right, and then on the flip side, we have Bree. I mean, Bree is talking about crowded, ebullient, joyful spaces, but your characters instead are basically walking this surreal landscape where basically everything around them has been wiped out and they're the last two people around, maybe. And so amazingly, unless you are an oracle, and if you are an oracle, now is the time to tell us, because we've got some questions. But you did start this before you knew that we were all going to be shutting down and that the streets literally would be empty. I mean, it's impossible to read your book without thinking of all of those news images of the streets in Paris and streets in New York and streets of London absolutely empty. So I would love to talk about this. I mean, that you did not deliberately set out to write a book about making connection, and a very human connection, in a world where there is such distance between people. But that is ultimately what the book has turned to be. And how do you mesh sort of what you wrote with the world that it is now coming out with, or coming out in?
Yeah, so it was definitely a little unnerving to see how real life started to unfold over the course of last year, and see all of these parallels start to pop up in my novel. At first I was a little bit worried that the pandemic would kind of steal my thunder, because I had created Hannah and Leah's Empty Streets as kind of a playground for readers' minds, so that they could kind of explore, safely imagine this world that was so different to what we lived in, the hyper overstimulated world that we lived in up until 2019. And so I really just wanted to explore, the image of some girl walking down an empty highway and hearing nothing. And then you suddenly could look out your window and see that. So that was really weird. But I think now that we're a year in, I think seeing my two main characters, Hannah and Leo, confront their isolation, it might strike a chord and kind of feel almost therapeutic for readers. Because when it all boils down, Hannah and Leo are trying to figure out who they are when society and all of its trappings have been stripped away completely, which is kind of what all of us have been doing lately. So you see them testing out different coping mechanisms and struggling to find what works for them. What do they lean on, and how do they survive emotionally? So in that way, the book can kind of be like a how-to guide, and at times it's a cautionary tale. But I do also want to say that, like, even though there are parallels, they're not on the surface. They're much deeper. So, there's nothing. We've all had enough of viruses and political turmoil, and the stir-crazy feeling of being trapped in your own house. So the book still does feel like escapism, I think, and like a surreal kind of adventure that you can go on.
Yeah. Again, it is such a great, compelling read that the first time I read it, I was like, where is this what's happening? And it unfolds beautifully. I'll just say that.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so Bree is our debut novelist on this panel. We have other people in the middle, and then on the other end is Francisco, who has written a few books, but his book actually, On the Hook, does cycle back to his first YA novel. And as an author, I am utterly fascinated by this, because what Francisco did was he actually went back to the first YA novel he had written, and he completely rewrote it, and really made it so palpable and real and very, very, very much of today. So my question for you, Francisco, is first, I mean, why did you go back to this book? What was it that stuck with you? And sort of what did you bring to it because you've lived with Hector, the main character, for so long? And then also, there's very much a lot in it about social justice, and the injustice spiral, how one bad choice can lead to all these bad things happening to you, and you can either decide to get revenge and continue the spiral, or you could try to work to end the spiral, which again resonated so deeply to me when I read it. So
you partially wrote it.
I would love to hear just again about your journey with the book, about again living with the character for so long, and then what it meant to be working on it now.
Yes, I first wrote kind of the bones of this book 15 years ago, and when the rights reverted to me after a few years from the previous publisher, Scholastic, picked it up, and we decided that we were going to rewrite it. It took me a while to do it. Was working on other books, and it took me a while to get Hector right. Hector is a young man who lives in the projects of El Paso. He's very intelligent. He's captain of his chess team. He wants to be an engineer so he can get his family out of the projects. And, his big goal is to stay under the radar so he's not noticed by the violent elements that surround him. But, unfortunately, that doesn't happen. And Hector gets caught in a kind of a violent spiral. And this quiet young man really kind of learns to hate. He becomes eaten by his own anger. And so I thought it was the way that Hector developed over the years was in my understanding of what that hatred is. And sort of maybe hopefully a little bit of a greater understanding of how to unhook ourselves, from that hatred. There was a lot of the hatred that I've witnessed in the past few years was maybe not quite there when I first started writing the book, and so I had that kind of immersion into seeing people that I admired, and who hated for what they thought was justifiable causes, but it was still, it was still kind of hatred. So, and I felt it in myself as well, and struggled with how to get rid of when is it okay to have that righteous anger, and when is it really kind of hurting you in some way. So those are the things that I learned through Hector. And obviously, I wrote between the first book and this one, there were 8 other books. So there was a lot of learning especially about writing an interesting book for young men who really don't like to read that much and who are perhaps at risk themselves, So I kind of kept that young reader in mind as I was writing this, and used whatever I learned through all those years to create a novel that I hope is meaningful to them.
I think it will be. And I'm so glad you went back to Hector.
Thank you.
All right, Debbie. So, on a lighter but still resonant note. So Simone breaks all the rules. It's such a great read, and Simone is such a great character. So you've written a book about a girl who wants to shake things up, break some of the rules, which is not exactly what her Haitian immigrant parents want her to do. And though, while this is not a memoir, it is not autobiography, obviously it is very much informed by the community that you grew up in. So I would love for you to talk about sort of what it was like to dive into Simone's world, and to sort of have her be the rebel that she is.
Yes, and she has a side eye that I wish I had. So she's definitely more of a rebel than I am, but it's correct. The frame of the story is sort of structured with autobiographical elements, for sure. I would say I used a lot of the physical and emotional landmarks. sort of like New Jersey, Metro New York area, Haitian household, overprotected teen years. So I know, like, I think back to growing up, I feel like my thinking has always been sort of breaking the fourth wall, kind of an examination of things in real time. I don't know if it's the writer in me or, but even though I may not have had sort of the language or kind of pieced all the puzzle pieces together, I feel like, I definitely had the sense of, it was clear that like my life wasn't as proactive as other lives, not only fictional lives and the reading and the viewing that I consumed, but also, friends' lives, my life was full and everything like that. But I just feel like that sort of that ability to be activated and, I was impulsive, but there was a difference in what I saw. And so like it led me eventually to ask the question, how does this bubble that I'm in, how does that sort of impede or stunt, the exploration of self, and, like our parents for sure, they're afraid looking back, raising 4 girls in, you could say sort of predatory environment, you can see why. But how much of that restriction becomes internalized to the point where, you're self-restrictive. And there's a part of the story where Simone feels dejected at one moment and she looks down at her shoes and she's like, even Dorothy could wander off the Yellow Brick Road once in a while. Like, am I fated to sort of toe the line? She's trying to shake things up and she realizes the challenges to doing that. And it kind of because she internalized some of this stuff. And so even as I got older, I think one of my earliest writings, one of the feedback was, the character needs a little more agency. And I was like, aha, like I need to meditate on that if I ever do meditate. But it kind of sinks in when moments like that happened and to me, and I'm still sort of figuring things out. And, that's why I still consider myself a late bloomer. But it definitely felt cathartic writing this for readers and friends and people in the community, especially in immigrant communities that kind of are grappling with some of these questions that they're asking themselves in their meta moments. How can you sort of conquer the world if you have to be in the house before the street light comes on? Like how do you get started with doing that while you're young? To the point where you can be more prepared as an adult.
No, again, I think the book, lots of young readers are going to relate to that. All right, so since we're talking about shelf care, we're now opening it up to everybody. This is our panel time. So clearly, you've all put a lot of yourselves into your books, especially these books. And so I want to talk about sort of how do you take care of yourself when you are exposing something about yourself on the page and putting your truths on the page, because that is not an easy thing to do at all. It's an important thing to do, but it's not an easy thing to do. So how do you take care of yourself while you're doing that? Are there times where you realize that something is too personal to actually put on the page, that you want to keep something for yourself because you don't owe the book everything? And then also, just to talk about, do you know what you're putting of yourself into the book while you're writing it, or is it something that only really comes out afterwards, that you read it over and you go, oh my goodness, I was actually talking about all of these autobiographical things that I didn't realize I was doing. That's how it works for me. I tricked myself into being honest about myself. So let's start with Bri.
Okay, so I think my answer is maybe that sometimes I don't take care of myself very well. I want to give the stories everything that I have. So sometimes my, deepest fears and worst moments do get a bit riled up. and sometimes I do feel empty because I've put too much on the page. But at the same time, there's something really satisfying about those moments where I'm writing and I start to feel like flayed open, because if I can be writing a scene and make myself cry or make myself feel like a stomach churning dread, or even, you know, a nicer thing like the first flutters of love or something, then I think there's a good chance that will help the readers feel that too. So I guess, I don't know. My answer is that I take care of myself after I've done it, and you know, I let the damage happen, and then the feeling, the satisfaction that like I've put something real out there, is maybe the self-care I give myself afterwards. But unlike you, I think I also kind of trick myself into being in my character's head. I was thinking about this, and I used to work backstage in theater, and it meant that I had to take some acting courses in college, which was really terrifying. And what I do as a writer kind of reminds me what actors do. Like they sometimes have to think of a situation in their past that can inform their emotions for an upcoming scene, and then they channel that. So even if the character's situation is different on the surface, the bedrock emotion can be used. And after some practice, I think that kind of happens for me now without me even consciously knowing that it's happening. And like you, I don't realize which snippets of my emotions are being channeled into the writing until later.
Absolutely. Debbie, how about you?
I agree with that. I do trick myself, but I feel like I do put everything in. I'm the type of person, I take notes, sort of like relatable observations that I use later as metaphors. So, you know, I feel like young people could relate to these like observations, you know, like, for example, somebody who leaves their Christmas lights on until late into winter. I'll use it in a way that I feel like it's an entry point for people to kind of convey something that I really want to say. But I check my notes, and I kind of want to pour everything that I have into it, every observation that I've made, every sort of like aha notes that I've made. I don't often use it all, but that's my aim, because I sometimes think, okay, if I only have this one shot, you know, I'm going to just go for it and just throw the kitchen sink. And, you know, sometimes if I do have another book lined up, I'll make a separate list. But I basically see myself putting a lot of what I think and what I go through into a story. And I trick myself into believing it's not really actually me, but I do see that there's a lesson in there for me too, maybe later on, but I see it eventually, often with in the editing phase. I do see that.
Francisca, how about you? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I'm writing about characters who intend to kill each other, so I have to be kind of careful that I don't carry too much of that into my life. I take care of my grandson in the mornings. He's 2 years old, and so that kind of keeps you pretty well, balanced in terms of perspective and so forth. So when I write in the afternoons, I still see writing as the reason why I'm in this world in many ways, but it's just a part of my life, and I've learned, I think in some ways, I've learned to hold back a little bit, not only to protect myself, but also because I think that the writing becomes more effective in terms of the reader when you evoke rather than completely describe, so there's a little bit of a distance in what I'm doing, but hopefully, it's still a connection to something that is deep inside of me.
Yeah. Leah, how about you?
So I was raised on the internet, literally have been online in some capacity pretty much my entire life. And so like the line for me between the personal and the public has always been very blurry. And so when I wrote You Should See Me a Crown, which was my first book, I didn't think to separate my experience from that of my main character. I just wrote what I knew, which is like a town similar to the town where I grew up, a girl similar to the girl I was when I was 15, 16 years old. And over time, not that much time, mind you, because this is 2 books in 1 pandemic, so we were moving pretty fast. But I had to develop sort of a set of boundaries between what belongs to me and what belongs to my work. Can I pull from my work, or can I pull from my real life to put it into my real work? Yes, I can. But to put so much of myself into the work that I can't really always find the line between what's real and what's fiction, that like I had to put a firm kibosh on that. And, you know, I came out of like the MFA background. Like I started writing my first book immediately after graduating from my MFA program. And for anybody who's got an MFA, a lot of these programs are populated by like brooding white literary fiction dudes who like grew up on David Foster Wallace. And so to them, art is pain. So, you know, being in these spaces, I was like, if I'm not miserable, is it art? And as it turns out, yes, it is still art, even when you're not miserable when you're working on it. So, you know, always trying to cling to the joy in the work and trying to find really firm lines between what belongs to me and what belongs to the story has been really helpful in moving forward and taking care of myself.
Totally. Well, I think that goes back to what Brie was saying. I do think we don't give enough credit to the fact that we do put our pain in the books. We also put our joy in the books, and we put all the things we love about the world into the books too. Mason, how about you?
Oh, I wish I could steal Leah's answer. I wish that were me. Because I'm so both aware and unaware of what I put from myself into my books. Like sometimes I'm pulling, like I Wish Y'all the Best, for example, like the description of Ben's art room and their relationship with their art teacher is pulled exactly from my senior year of high school. That's just verbatim, like down to how the classroom is laid out. But then there are sort of the invisible things that I didn't really think about that like were in my subconscious mind and just like wigged their way into the book somehow. I think when it comes to taking care of myself, I try to be very careful about it. Like David, you know better than anyone, like the Ghost We Keep had a different character dying. It was originally going to be Liam's father, and that hit too close to home for me, and I just could not write that book. And so I had to reach out to you and like ask you if it was okay if we could switch it. And there was, you know, before I sent the email, there was this voice in the back of my head. It's like, well, if it's tough to write, doesn't that mean that you should write it? And all this, like, you know, suffer for the art. But like Leah said, like, you know, there's joy in art. There's supposed to be joy in art. There should be joy in the art that you create. And so there's nothing wrong with, if you feel like something is too hard to write, I think it is worth analyzing why you think that way. But I also think it's important to realize that you come first as a person over the art that you create. And it's never worth it to sacrifice so much of yourself to the point that it becomes like detrimental to your physical or mental health. I wish I knew how to take care of myself in my writing, besides stepping back and taking like just links of time away from my keyboard and away from Word. I have to figure out better ways to deal with that. But yeah.
Sabina, how about you?
I'm terrible at taking care of myself, but I have children for that, and a husband and a puppy, and they kind of make me. So, you know, they're not that impressed with me or anything, you know, about the books. I mean, they love the books and all, but during this pandemic, we've played so many card games and board games and watched movies. So I have to be there for that, because otherwise, you know, so they pull me away from just, you know, sitting in front of the laptop all day writing, because I can do that. Like, I'm a workaholic by nature. I could sit there and just write or do something, you know, to do with writing. And it's not always good, you know, to just, you know, I try to find some balance in my life, but it's hard to do it on my own. So I'm grateful that I have family that forces me to do that. But as far as my characters are concerned, I've waited so long to be able to tell stories about, you know, where I come from and my childhood and things like that, and things that immigrants go through, and just the good things, the struggles, but there's also the triumphs and all the happy stuff and all the fun stuff, the weddings, the celebrations, and everything. And I never got to see that, and my daughters never got to see that. When 30 years later, so. That for me, that's something that, it makes it so easy for me to completely immerse myself in, and create characters that are going through the same kinds of things that I went through. So it's very blurry, that line between, my own experience and the characters' experiences. And, it's just how I am by, my nature as well. I am pretty much of an open book. You see what you see is what you get type of thing. So my characters are like that too. And I think it's just the natural way they come out. It's from my own experiences. So all the side characters, the aunts and the relatives and the arguments and the funny things they say, those are all based in some way on my many, many, many relatives. My father had 14 siblings. There's a lot to pick from and play with. And so, and I've traveled a lot, and I've lived in a lot of different places, and I've faced a lot of the things that my characters face. And I've also enjoyed a lot of the things that my characters enjoy. And so it's really just natural for me to put all of that into my stories. So I couldn't tell you, if I pick a certain character, I couldn't tell you how much of me is in there, how much of my kids, how much of my own parents and stuff. So yeah, I think that's how it's going to be for me, unless I write about unicorns or something. But as long as I'm writing contemporary, it's definitely going to be based on my own experiences.
Let me tell you, though, that you write that unicorn book and then you read it over, you're like, I'm really writing about me.
Who knows?
I mean, maybe that's just me. I'm going to jump to a question I had later, because I think it actually does go to what you're talking about, sort of the enjoyment and the joy and making sure you put those experiences in. Because I believe two key ingredients of YA are love and hope. And that it's very hard to find a YA novel that does not grapple with issues of love and hope. And this isn't to say it's easy. Again, I think love and hope are both extraordinarily complicated things. And I think especially for teen characters, you're often grappling with them before you really have the articulation to know how to grapple with them. And obviously as adults, we still grapple with the complexities of love and hope. So I would love for you to talk about sort of the love and the hope in your books, and how that does factor in, and again, how conscious you are of wanting to offer your readers some love and some hope within your books when you're crafting them. So let's start with Debbie.
Oh, yes. Love and hope is super, super important. It's sort of what keeps me going. And so it's only natural that I infuse that in my characters and their way of thinking. And actually, it's something that I learned from my family. I know that there's I don't know if it's scripture, I don't know the Bible too well, but that says we despair, but not as those who have no hope. And in the Haitian culture, you might wonder, like, why are these people just so hopeful? And so the sense of humor that my family carries is, to me, a sign of that hope. And the despairing never got so deep to the depths of because of the fact that there's always someone that will say something to boost the spirit, or they look at life in a way that has trained me to understand that, laughter, if we're talking about humor, because I love writing with humor. Humor is a way to show that, you are more eternal than your problems. It's, if you can laugh at it, it's sort of, it's showing that, looking in the face of the demon and just laughing or whatever. But my family, it's never off limits for a comedy. Like, no place has been off limits, and that's taught me a lot. And I find myself getting into very oh no moments, and I'm like, I have to remind myself, like, where I'm from, because it does slip from me. And then because a lot of those people are no longer in my life, they've passed on. So I have to keep that in mind. And the way I do that is to write from that way. And I know that there's a very close relationship between laughter and crying. I remember being a kid and hearing what I thought was my mom crying, and my heart skipped. I was like, is she, and then I heard her continuing to laugh. And so it's still a release of tension, in that laughter. And that's what we've clung to throughout the sagas that we've been through in life. But let me tell you, there's even at a funeral, somebody will make a joke and it'll be someone you least expect. Like it would be my grandmother who, like, we chuckled at her husband's funeral. Like she was with my step grandfather for like 50 years. And she was walking by looking really sad. And then she goes, "Hey, they're going to say that you're the one that did it," and we're like, "Oh my gosh, he died of natural causes." But, she, for her to come up with that is incredible. And I think of that at times. And my mom, before she passed away, one of the last things she told me was, "When you think of me, laugh," in our last conversation, that's what she told me. So I carry that with me and I put that in my writing.
I say, and you pour it into the books beautifully.
Thank you.
Leah, how about you? Love and hope.
You know what? I write romances, and so the love is pretty clear. That's like very obvious, or at least I hope it is. Otherwise, I need to revamp my whole career. But that said, one of the my favorite touchstones as a writer is something Elizabeth Acevedo said at this conference a couple of years ago. She was like, when young Black girls come to my stories, I want them to know that I love them, whether what I'm doing on the page is a love story, whether it's explicitly comedic or, whatever. I want them to feel so seen and cared for that they know that I, as the writer, love them. And that to me is the most essential tenet of my work, is like, even when stuff is not funny, like haha funny, I want you to be so cared for that, like, I'm always going to get you out of this. You know what I'm saying? Like the ending is always going to be something that heartens you, or that shows that it's possible for you to be all of who you are and still have the ending you deserve, which is something that is joy that isn't always in exchange for trauma. And so, that's the thing that I think most about. And also, I want to go back to the last question really quickly, because you're saying something about love and hope in this that I think is really important. It kind of touches on this other thing. Using your book every day as like an example, this is like a narrator that's like disembodied. Like they're just in a different body every day. It's not even one person. But the thing that makes this book so incredible is that like the fears that every human being has are like inherent to this disembodied thing that bumps from person to person, And so like that to me is such a great example of like a story isn't about like the actual shape that the character takes. It's about the emotional heart of the character. And so like, that's one of those things that I think about a lot too when I'm working on a new book.
Yeah, I mean, because it's the question of what gets us through, and love and hope are often the answers. Sabina, how about you?
I think in my stories, I mean, for example, for Zara, the stuff that she's going through is so, it's so frustrating, and she feels so like everything's out of her control. And if it wasn't for the love of her family and her friends and the hope she feels to if she didn't have that support and love from her family, and if she didn't have the hope in her that there is a way to get around it and to continue with her life as she had planned, then really, I mean, what would keep her going? And that's really, like, that's something, again, I felt in my own life. For every ugly incident and, frustrating and, discriminatory experience that I've had a multitude of wonderful experiences with friends and people that were there behind me to lift me up so that I could continue. And you go on because, in my case, I did it for my children. I mean, I didn't feel that I could just sit back and feel bad and just give up, because I had two young children who were counting on me. And I wanted them to see that, there's always hope. And as long as you have, a loving family and a loving support system, that you can get through even the worst times. And yes, of course, like you said, it's not easy. It can be, really painful sometimes, but at least you have that. And it's kind of a driving force. And there's also like, I think, culturally and in your community, in the Love and Lives of Roxana Ali, her parents treat her so horribly, but she still has hope that one day they'll they'll change, that they'll grow, that they'll learn to understand and to accept her as she is. And I think that's important, because otherwise, I mean, she would just leave her family and go. And then, yes, she could live her life, but it would be without the people that, that she wants around her. And I think it's important for readers to get that feeling that, there is always hope, no matter what's happening. And yes, sometimes, things don't work out. But I mean, I really want them to work out in my stories, just because I don't want to end on this sort of, this kind of pool of misery and despair, right? So, yeah, I think to me, it's really important. And I think it's really important to readers as well to get that, to end the story with that sense of hope and feel that the love that the character feels.
Yeah. Bree, how about you?
Yeah, I think in my book, love and hope are so important to Hannah and Leo. They are the two things that kind of become the key to their literal survival. Yeah. And the book is like, you can't really squeeze it into one category, which is a bit weird, but I've always seen it as kind of primarily a romance, and that's what it started out as. So there's lots of like, juicy tension and will they, won't they, and it is like a lot about their love, but it's also, they have to fall in love with themselves over the course of the book, which is such a huge part of growing up and beyond. So yeah, it's a massive part of Hannah and Leo's story.
Yeah, it truly is the thing that helps them navigate what they're doing. And I think it is a strength of the book that it so defies category. That's one of the joys of it, is reading it and going, what am I into? We're in for. All right, Mason, again, I think particularly for Ghosts We Keep, when you are dealing with such weighty things, it is important to make sure you have that through line of love and hope. So how did you navigate that?
I mean, I don't know if there was any navigating it. I like hope. Trans kids go through just so much on a daily basis, and it seems to get better and then it gets worse. It's like 2 steps forward, 500 steps back in terms of just being able to protect trans people, especially trans teens. And I think part of that has become so ingrained in my head that I'm desperate to make sure that trans kids have this space where, it's not, necessarily true that, my books are happy throughout. I Wish You All the Best starts very harshly, and The Ghost We Keep is kind of just a sucker punch of trauma every few pages. But the thing that I like about my own stories is that I always end with hope. The end of I Wish You All the Best, the relationship between Ben and Nathan is very hopeful, and not going to spoil The Ghost We Keep, but I feel like the ending of that book is very hopeful. And to me, hope is just this incredibly important thing, especially after the mess we just got out of. But, we're still feeling the effects of that now. And I just think that it's incredibly important. And it's almost accidental on my part, but also purposeful in a way, just because I always want it to be there.
Francisco, how about you?
Yes, I mean, I think that for this kind of story, love and hate almost have to be redefined a little bit. It has to be earned. The love and love and hope. It's you're never going to get two people like these two characters who are going to love each other. I think in the end, there's a hostility that continues, but kind of an understanding that I can live with that, and there's a glimpse of humanity in the other one, and a reflection of you and the other person, that it's not love, but it's, sometimes it's about as good as we can get, in terms of living with each other. And the same thing with hope. I mean, when you're living in circumstances that are just not within your power to get out of, it's hope becomes not the expectation of some good result in the future, but becomes like I can live with this, I can live with this regardless of how bad it is. And so I think that for these books, in order to have an impact on certain of our young people, who are in really tough situations, I mean, they really have to reflect really their lives, so that's what I think I've tried to do in On the Hook, and hopefully I get there a little bit.
I think you do. And I think what better note to end on than a note of hope. Our novels end with hope, so let's end our panel with hope. Thank you all for being a part of this. This is wonderful. I'm glad that it's recorded, because so many of you said so many things I wanted to write down, because, oh my God, that's so true. And again, what I love the most about these panels is the articulation of these things that we know are true. And then suddenly another author says it. And you're like, that's exactly, yes, that what she said, what they said, what he said. So thank you all for sharing your insights and for sharing your books and your shelf care. For all of you, y'all West, please pick up their books. The new books, Sabina's is out as of this panel, and everybody else's will be coming out very, very soon. So please pre-order them, pick them up. And again, we hope that you will get love and hope and lots of other emotions out of them. So thanks so much for joining us, and thank you again, authors.
Thank you.
Thank you.